It's always fun to have a look at a match that's a proper clash between styles, and we've certainly got one of those here. The time when Toshiaki Kawada ended up on the other side of the ring from Mick Foley, defending his All Japan Triple Crown title. Not exactly two wrestlers that people would imagine sharing a ring, but there you go. It's a curious little match, one that's fun to examine in the whole context of pro res in 2004, and one between two people who, when you look at their careers, had a fair bit more in common than you might think. We'll get into all of that, of course, but the idea of Kawada versus Foley may well bring up a lot of strange visions in people's minds. Is Kawada going to go hardcore and start pulling out barbed wire bats, tables and the like, the sort of thing he basically never did in the entirety of his career? Will we see Mick take some ridiculously inadvisable bump, or will he try and go blow for blow with one of the greatest strikers wrestling has ever seen? All these questions will be answered when we look at the match itself, but for now we start with a bit of background because, well, that's just how we roll around here. As far as pro res goes, Toshiaki Kawada doesn't need much of a general introduction. We've done plenty of videos on him, he's one of the greatest wrestlers of them all, and so on. That said, we haven't looked at too much of Dangerous K in the time after the big All Japan Noah split in 2000, so we ought to see just how he's doing. And the answer is that he's doing very well. Here in 2004, Toshiaki Kawada is in the middle of a long reign with the All Japan Triple Crown, the sort of reign that people may have thought he should have had back in the heyday of the 1990s. This reign, Kawada's fifth with the three belts, began on 6th of September 2003 with a one-night tournament for the title, which had been vacated after reigning champion Shinya Hashimoto suffered a shoulder injury. Kawada defeated the Gladiator, Mike Awesome of course, and then conquered Shinjiro Atani in the final to begin a reign that, at the time of the match against Foley, had lasted a day shy of 8 months, already longer than the entirety of the time he'd spent with the crown over his previous 4 reigns. While a 40-year-old Kawada is hardly considered to be in his prime anymore, he's certainly still putting on bangers. There's a lot of good title bouts over his reign, and it's worth a look at in full someday. On the whole though, it's an odd time for All Japan. We're kind of in the early days of the pro wrestling love era, something that didn't necessarily start with Keiji Muto becoming the company's president in September of 2002, but slowly built up from his ascension. More stables, more angles, more things that would be considered sports entertainment. It's a time that certainly brought some mixed reactions, although it is also something that can be looked on as having a great influence on other companies over the years, particularly New Japan. With all this going on, Kawada being at the top is something of a link to the past, back to the heyday of Kins Road in the 90s, even if slowly but surely, more and more of the links to that era are being cut loose. And what of his opponent? Well, Mick Foley wasn't exactly a full-time wrestler anymore, he'd been in retirement since 2000. However, the first half of 2004 would see him make a bit of a short return to the squared circle, and it certainly wasn't a return without any quality. We'll look at that shortly, but what of his other work in Japan before this? Of course, Foley's prime Puro years were 1995 and 1996 in IWA Japan, the King of the Death match and all that, big and brutal matches on the top of the card, the sort that were watched a lot both in Japan and in the West. Hell, I imagine that a lot of people's first experiences of watching Japanese wrestling involved Mick Foley, as Cactus Jack, taking on the likes of Shoji Nakamaki, Tarzan Goto, and of course Terry Funk. So he certainly already has a place in the canon as something of a gateway to Puro, certainly to its more hardcore side. But death matches aside, there's actually some work in Japan for Foley in the times before IWA, taking us all the way back to 1991, and to where else but All Japan. Foley, again as Cactus Jack, worked the Champion Carnival that year. This was a time when initially Foley had been in the wilderness after he left WCW for the first time in 1990, but in the following months he became white hot in smaller promotions like the Herb Abrams UWF and Global, not to mention the American Indies, primarily in hardcore matches against the late great Eddie Gilbert that quickly became the stuff of legend amongst tape traders and sparks. They were doing things people had barely seen before, and soon enough Cactus Jack was brought back to the chaotic world of WCW in a much bigger role than before, lined up for what would end up being a classic rivalry with Sting. But before all that, how did he fare in All Japan? If you looked at the bare bones results, you might not imagine he fared very well. He ended up going pointless in the Champion Carnival, losing all of his matches. However, this is pro wrestling and that's not how things work. Simply by being brought in for the 91 Carnival, the first one in 9 years, Foley was positioned as something of a big deal. After all, if you're in the Carnival, you're automatically having singles bouts with the top guys. Indeed, the match we're covering today wasn't actually Foley's first meeting with Toshiaki Kawada. They had a bout in this Carnival, although unfortunately there doesn't appear to be footage of it. There are a couple of matches available from this time. We've got one singles bout from the Carnival against Dan Crawford, a tag match where Foley and his tag partner for the trip, the awesomely named Texas Terminator Hoss, take on the Funk Brothers, and another cam shot bout outside the Carnival against Kenta Kobashi. Most of these are simply curiosities, but they're usually short and action-packed. The best match, though, is one that did get shown on TV. Cactus Jack's first Carnival match was against no less a figure than Jumbo Tsuruta. It's a 5-minute bout from March 26th, and Foley certainly pulls out all the stops. He gets most of his offence in on the floor, pulling up the mats and doing the elbow off the apron, but not long after he takes a backdrop on the floor and then does the absolute whopper bump from the apron to the concrete off a Jumbo clothesline, the old nasty plunge. According to Foley himself in a 2021 interview with Monthly Pro Res, he broke 3 of his ribs on this, but naturally still works the rest of the tour. The fan shot with Kobashi is cool too. You get to see Foley do the cactus clothesline, which is always neat, and generally it's amusing to watch Foley working in a traditional wrestling singlet, complete with leopard print pants. For the most part, it wasn't a bad trip for Foley. Word from the Observer was that Giant Bubba liked his work and gave him a bunch more dates than he was originally booked for, although Johnny Ace got an arm injury working with him, which it seems that Foley blamed himself for. He also had a fan in Stan Hansen. According to the aforementioned Monthly Pro Res Q&A, Hansen really liked Cactus Jack and made him look damn good on his last match of the tour, a tag bout where Foley basically kicked out of everything bar the Western Lariat. It seems as though if different decisions had been made, it's possible that Mick Foley could have done more with All Japan at the time, but obviously things didn't work out that way. And so we fast forward through a whole lot of age and a whole lot of ring damage to 2004. Foley has been back in the ring and he's had a good time of it. There's the WrestleMania 20 match teaming with The Rock against Evolution, of course, but mainly there's the match he had at Backlash against Randy Orton. Jack vs Orton was an absolute stunner, a bloody brawl to hell and back over the Intercontinental title, a match far beyond anyone's expectations, and probably one of Mick Foley's crowning achievements. He gave it his absolute all, and in doing so basically assured old Randy's ascension to the top that would happen mere months later. Oh, and this absolutely hellacious contest took place a mere 3 weeks before this contest with Toshiaki Kawada that we're covering. A couple of days after the bout, Foley tore a ligament in his knee simply from standing up, presumably related to that match and, well, everything else. It's not exactly ideal wrestling conditions, and indeed Foley wasn't planning on doing any wrestling so soon after the Orton bout. He wasn't booked as Kawada's initial opponent. So who was? Well, that would have been Bill Goldberg. The rather unique thing about this Triple Crown bout is that it's not happening in an All Japan ring, it's happening in a Hustle ring. Hustle being the promotion set up by Pride owners Dream Stage Entertainment, which we've covered in a previous video. This is still the early days of Hustle, so it's not quite a full-on comedy promotion yet, and Goldberg had been brought in as a big-ticket attraction. He headlined the company's first show on January 4, 2004, defeating Naoya Ogawa, and was then booked to face Kawada on 8th May in Hustle's third show at the Yokohama Arena. Of course, this didn't happen. Goldberg suffered a rather nasty hand infection a couple of weeks before the show and had to pull out. Indeed, the match against Ogawa ended up being the only match he did for Hustle, as he retired not long after this infection. The result of the Kawada-Goldberg match would have almost certainly seen Dangerous K walk out of Hustle with his belts one way or another, but most likely following a double countout. There's no way on earth that All Japan, having already worked with Bill the previous year with disappointing results, would have wanted to pay Goldberg any more massive appearance fees. Speaking of which, Hustle now has a whole top of the card to fill with Goldberg gone. Naturally, they reach out to Goldberg's agent, Barry Bloom, who also happens to represent Mick Foley. Bloom asked Foley if he'd do the bout, and while Foley hardly wanted to, what with his injury, well, he'd be getting Goldberg's appearance fee, which, if reports were accurate, was $125,000 per shot. Foley may have had a whole lot of trouble walking, but quite understandably there's no way on this planet that he was going to turn down that kind of money for a single match. In his words, he'd take a numbing shot of some medication that undoubtedly wasn't good for him, and away he'd go. Barry Bloom also represented Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, and they ended up on the card too, for $75,000 each. The outsiders would main event the supercard, going against Shinya Hashimoto and Naoya Ogawa. Notably, Dream Stage were only willing to offer a max of $25,000 each to Nash and Hall when negotiations started before Goldberg's injury, but afterwards, well, things changed, especially with them being desperate and the outsiders very much now in the driving seat. Jeez, whole stacks of money are getting chucked about, but that's the early hustle all over, spunking tons of cash on what was, initially, a pretty damn miserable product. They also tried to set up a deal with Hulk Hogan, and were even in talks with Stone Cold Steve Austin at one point with a view to bringing him in and quite possibly even running that ultra mega dream match, the all-time Battle of the Baldies, Austin vs Goldberg. But of course, a deal never came remotely close to reality, and eventually Hustle had to stop splashing cash on big-ticket American names that barely moved. In what little time there is to build the match up, we have a press conference and contract signing, in which Foley signals his intention to take a barbed wire bat and use it many times on Kawada's body. He says that he won the King of the Death match in Yokohama, he intends to win the Triple Crown here in Yokohama, and the personal history is played up. Kawada may not remember the match they had in 1991, but Mick Foley will make sure he remembers him in the ring. And Kawada's young boy promptly gets put to the sword, or rather the bat. You may recognise him in fact. That young boy is none other than Taichi, who was trained and mentored by Dangerous K. Now while you may look at Kawada and Foley, you think they're very different, and you'd largely be right, there are a few similarities aside from simply the lack of teeth. Here I'm going to take a page out of the book of Joseph Monticello, who's written about this match and made this point. For a lot of their careers, Kawada and Foley have always been looking up at a glass ceiling, one that they had to go to extreme lengths in order to try and break. Toshiaki Kawada was one of All Japan's biggest names back in the King's Road era and thought of as one of the best wrestlers in the world, and yet during that decade he only ever held onto the crown for a total of 175 days. As great as he was always second fiddle to Mitsuharu Misawa, always a step behind. Similarly, Mick Foley carved his way through every last thing holding him back in people's eyes to become one of the biggest stars of the 90s, but even then he was still never quite able to truly make the top of the mountain. He spent a total of 29 days as the WWE champ. But, as Foley once said in the ring to CM Punk, wrestling isn't about statistics, it's about the moments that define us. And, after all this chatter, it's about time to see how Mick Foley and Toshiaki Kawada fare against each other at this moment. We get started with strikes. Foley throws his shots, but it's not surprising that Kawada takes the advantage with his low kicks, followed by elbows and kicks to the chest in the corner. This opening is perhaps unconventional in how conventional it is. You may not have expected Foley to actually try and outstrike and even out-wrestle Kawada, but here we are. Of course, he comes up wanting, and Kawada gets the better of all the opening exchanges. Foley gets the odd hit in, but Kawada won't give up the centre, and soon a sidekick nearly sends Foley spilling outside. Foley manages to get Kawada on the ropes and tries to set up for the clothesline, but Kawada reverses with a back body drop, sending Foley to the ramp. Kawada continues to press, and for the frustrated Foley, it becomes clear that traditional wrestling's not going to work out here. When Dangerous K goes to the ring, Foley calls for the bat, which is provided by Yuji Shimada, heel representative of Generalissimo Takada's Monster Army. Foley throws chairs to the ring ECW style, and when Taichi Ishikari tries to stop Foley's advance, he gets another bat-based battering. Still, Foley isn't yet able to bring the bat in. A combination of Kawada and referee Kyohei Wada helped to stop him from doing so. Kawada continues to mount strikes in the corner, but Foley is able to counter and scores with a pull-in pile driver for a 2 count. Foley is finally able to mount a bit of offense with stomps and a baseball slide to send Kawada outside, followed by the slide into an outside swinging neckbreaker and the big old cactus apron elbow. Definitely his strongest portion of the match so far, and we're around 6 minutes in. Back in the ring, Foley hits a quick suplex, and when Kawada tries to throw strikes, uses an eye rake to get him to the corner. More strikes ground Kawada, and Foley hits the old running knee. Foley surprisingly goes for a rear naked choke, but Dangerous K soon manages to find the ropes and escape. Old Cactus though still has the advantage, hitting the double arm DDT when Kawada tries to get up and getting his closest fall yet. Shimada returns with the bat, and Foley has it in the ring this time, trying to make Kawada taste the wire of Barbie. But he resists and finally counters with a backdrop. Foley tries to run at Kawada with the bat, but eats a few boots, followed by the gunmen Giri, and there is a cool moment where Dangerous K grabs the bat, and we wonder for a second if he's about to go hardcore. But no, he shouts at Shimada and chucks the nefarious object in his direction. However, this does allow Foley to get back in with a couple of clotheslines, and then he reaches into his shirt. There's actually a much bigger pop than you might expect for the arrival of Mr. Socko. The audience certainly knows who he is. Kawada is able to initially stop the Sock with some Kawada kicks, and I swear I hear some faint boos because of it. The pain continues with the big running boot in the corner and a whopper of a lariat for a near fall, and Kawada then locks in the stretch plum. There's a whole lot of wrenching, and while Foley's most certainly not going to quit, it does produce another near fall. Kawada piles kicks onto the kneeling Foley, but when he looks for a possibly finishing running kick, Shimada trips him from the outside, and when he gets up, Foley is finally able to lock in the mandible claw. Is that horrid stinky sock going to give the free belts over to Mrs. Foley's baby boy? No. Kawada's able to wrench it away, and a big strike exchange starts. Foley tries to land some telling punches, but Kawada responds with 4 vicious elbows and the Gamengiri for a near fall. And then Kawada lines it up, and one final, decisive roundhouse kick to the head of the seated Foley is enough. Toshiaki Kawada has successfully defended the Triple Crown in a match lasting a little shy of 13 minutes. Nothing of note really happens in the post-match aside from Kawada getting the belts put on him and then saluting the crowd. So, what to make of this match? It's fine. Not exactly a match that will go down as one of the greats, but it's a perfectly okay affair that doesn't outstay its welcome. 13 minutes ends up being the ideal length for it. When some other factors are considered, a bit of credit has to be handed out. Considering that Mick Foley could barely walk, he gave a fine performance, delivering most of his spots and taking a few big old tumbles. Is all of that wise from a health perspective, with a torn ligament and all of that? Well, no, but it's hard to blame Foley for taking the match considering that the payday was so frickin' big. In his third autobiography, The Hardcore Diaries, Foley talks a little about the match, saying that he did spend a few hours vomiting in the toilet following that vicious final kick, that he had to use a wheelchair at Narita Airport, and that he did the match solely for the money, saying that it may have made him feel like a whore, but he was, at least for that one night, an extremely high dollar one. As for Kawada, well, he was Kawada. Largely he was on top, doing his thing, albeit in a match that's a bit more sports entertainment than the Kawada norm, to say the least. Again, this isn't a must-watch by any means, certainly not when it comes to Toshiaki Kawada title bouts, but it's certainly a curiosity, and the final result isn't bad at all. Unsurprisingly, it was a whole lot better than the Outsiders tag main event, which blew more chunks than Foley did in the bog after the bout. As for the whole show itself, it wasn't a success. The Yokohama crowd, deathly quiet for a lot of it, was announced to be 12,057, but the real numbers were around 5,500, and a good chunk of that was papered. It should be noted that Foley, Hall and Nash weren't the only outside guys brought in for the show. The undercard also featured Dusty Rhodes, Tigerjeet Singh, an excellent 8-man bout featuring AAA wrestlers, Sabu, Gladiator and other hardcore talents. Basically, a lot of money was spent, and it did sweet Fanny Adam for the show's performance, particularly seeing as all the chaos meant that the biggest names were barely advertised. A lot of the more established home talents, the likes of Kawada and Shinjiro Atani, were also refusing to do any American-style vignettes, angles and the like. Dreamstage cut the budget significantly for Hustle's next show. Possible negotiations with the likes of Austin ended, Goldberg was pretty much out anyway, doing filming, and while Foley could have possibly returned, he instead decided to take much needed knee surgery. The fourth Big Hustle show, also at Yokohama, was headlined by a tag match featuring Naoya Ogawa and Riki Choshu against Yoji Anjo and Dan Bobish, a quite significant step down in star power, and amusingly enough, the show performed about the same as the third Hustle card. Still not good in the slightest, but at least it didn't cost so much money. And with that, we're about finished with this match, one where we've seen a whole lot of desperate and bad business, one that does speak volumes about the rather lousy state of this young and flailing promotion trying to make bank off big American names and failing miserably at doing so, although the actual end result here, while weird, wasn't too bad. At least Mick Foley ended up with a pretty handsome payday. To paraphrase his words from the Hardcore Diaries, it won't go down on anyone's list of all-time mat classics, unless seeing Foley being kicked the shit out of by Kawada for 10 minutes is their idea of a good time, but at least it didn't suck. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, which also hopefully didn't suck, and until the next time, bye for now.